This is a Crash game with Crash characters. Maybe there are some changes, but some of these changes work, and I'd rather play something different over something too similar to its predecessor. I for one appreciate the steps Titans took to create a Crash Bandicoot that feels unique in its own way. But as you'll see, as much as I love Crash of the Titans, I'll admit they kind of strayed too far from what makes Crash, Crash. In concept, the Wrath of Cortex tried to do new things while maintaining Crash's original gameplay, but they didn't execute it well. But they didn't execute it well. Oh boy, have I been rather consistent with my opinions. I guess it really goes to show how much they change with the passage of time. Similarly, every series has a point where they want to try something revolutionary or transformative that breaks from the consistent formula they've followed throughout the years. The sad thing is that whenever this happens, the fanbase freaks out, and much division starts to spread within such groups. Look no further than to what Radical Entertainment did with Crash of the Titans. It was a more combat-centric platformer that had Crash spend more time punching than actually spinning. And, well, that change pissed people off. A lot of these fans will state that Titans goes against the identity of the series. But is that really the case? Usually an identity often refers to the integral elements that make up a series. If Crash isn't spinning crates, it's not Crash. If Spyro isn't collecting gems, it's not Spyro. This is why people say Jak and Daxter has an identity crisis. It changed gameplay styles too suddenly. But is this really such a deciding point in judging the quality of a franchise? If a game goes too left field, does that automatically make it bad? There are multiple examples of this, and we're going to look at a bunch of them. Some of them worked better than others, and we're going to ultimately figure out why that was the case. But of course, before we jump into that, let's take a look at the flip side. Is a franchise any better when it chooses to stick to its roots and change very minimally? Ape Escape 1 and 2 best exemplifies this, with the sequel being notorious for not innovating too much over the original. The first Ape Escape had the interesting concept of utilizing the dual analog sticks to control your gadgets. Maybe not too big of a deal now, but back then, there was a heavier reliance on the D-pad, which made this game all the more inventive in its own right. Combine that with the solid platforming challenges involved in catching apes and colorful level designs, and the end product was one of the most ingenious ideas for a 3D platformer in 1999. So, what does the sequel do to build upon the foundation of the first game? It just does the same thing. Perhaps you could argue that there are some differences. The bosses this time around feel like actual fights instead of just chasing Jake around. There are a couple of new gadgets, and that's pretty much it. What's so funny is that some of the changes are so minuscule, they're practically pointless. Like, they replace Spike with his cousin Jimmy, but they're so alike that you wonder what the purpose of doing something like this was. Some of the level designs are practically copy-paste. There may be a few details differing between them, but these are kind of insignificant. The story of Spectre controlling the apes is the same, except there's no time travel. Don't get me wrong, it's still a polished experience, but it does very little to expand upon the first game. It's just a first Ape Escape with better graphics. Maybe that's fine, but it begs the question, why should I play the same game a second time? Ultimately, it's redundant and is a missed opportunity to take the franchise in a more creative direction. This demonstrates the problem of a game being the same exact thing. Ape Escape 2 suffers from not doing anything substantial to move the series forward. It's still a fun time, but it doesn't do anything deeper. The same could be said for the Crash Bandicoot series with The Wrath of Cortex. The game was trying really hard to reproduce the experience of Warped, so much so that, well, it was warped all over again. Sure, there are a couple of new vehicles and you get to play as Coco on foot, but a lot of these new features felt minimal at best, and maybe even did more to hurt the experience because of how badly implemented they were. When Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin said there was nothing new to do with Crash Bandicoot after Team Racing, Wrath of Cortex proved them right. If you take a look at the development cycle behind Wrath of Cortex, then you'd see that the reason it didn't differ from past entries was because it was rushed out the door. If it had been a passion project, as Mark Cerny had envisioned, then Traveler's Tales would have tried to innovate the Crash Bandicoot formula. Would it have alienated some fans of the originals? Maybe, but it would have created a more inspiring fourth installment that would have left an impact on its audience rather than being a pile of meh. Some people like to make an analogy that if a bottle of Coke has the brand label but the drink is completely different, then it's not a Coke. Well, if I were to reverse that a little, if a bottle of Coke has a different brand label stating it's a new flavor, but the drink tastes exactly the same, it's not new. Perhaps there's nothing wrong with bringing the original taste again, especially if it was successful, but it has the potential to grow stale if it keeps doing this, and it'll lose some of its fan base if the flavor just kept being the same thing, because humans have shown as a species they are drawn to a desire for change and difference. Otherwise, we'd live a banal existence if everything was exactly alike. You might be thinking, okay, so maybe that's true. Then why is it that you don't view Jak 2 as a good sequel, despite it being an innovation over the original? Well, if we were to look at the first Jak and Daxter, there's no denying it was a technical masterpiece. Maybe on the surface, you could dismiss it as a Banjo-Kazooie clone, but the combination of day-to-night transitions and a seamless open world without a single loading time created a sense of exploration that wasn't seen in the 3D platformer genre before. I might even say that even as a clone of other collectathons, it managed to be very solid in its gameplay with how every task didn't feel repetitive and a lot of the level designs felt atmospheric. With so much love for the first game, you'd expect them to build off of what it did for the sequel. But times were changing, and Naughty Dog needed to adapt. Therefore, Jak 2 was rebuilt into a GTA-esque sandbox platformer. It still maintains some of the elements of the first game, like the day-to-night transitions and how the different areas feel seamlessly knit together to make a cohesive world, but there were more things taken away. Now the gameplay no longer focuses on collecting. It has more emphasis on completing missions, wielding firepower, and using other methods of transportation via hijacking vehicles. So, it was basically like a complete reimagining. The problem Jak 2 has is the opposite to Ape Escape 2. It tries to do too much so drastically. Because it tries to restart a lot of its concepts, the execution wasn't as solid. There was no hint that the story was going to take a major turn within the Jak and Daxter universe. Instead, if you ask me, the first game looked like it was hinting towards the return of Gol and Maya, but we didn't get that. A lot of the new characters are unlikable. I have no problem with edginess and all, but it feels very forced to the point, being broody is their only characteristic. Ahem, looking at you, Torn. It's even more awkward when they try to add comic relief with Daxter. Sure, some of his jokes are more mature, but it clashes with the darker tone of this game. Similar comments can be said about the gameplay. The vehicles are too slippery to control, and even though you can switch between air or ground-level terrain, there's always going to be shit obscuring your drive. On the ground, the slightest bump against one of the many Crimson Guards causes almost all of them to give chase. Zoomers flying in the opposite direction are easy to collide with. Basically, the cluttered nature of the city interferes with navigating through it. I guess I'll give some credit where it's due. The missions do have you utilizing a variety of gameplay styles. The gunplay is decent, if a tad underwhelming in the sense that it's rather limited in how it operates. One way they could have expanded upon it was to apply interesting ways to incorporate melee abilities with the shooting, which they only did with the yellow gun, but none of the others. All in all, the big idea here is that none of these criticisms have anything to do with the game being different. It's just that the changes aren't designed that well, and don't feel as if they transition smoothly from the first to the second. Ratchet & Clank Future Tools of Destruction has the same exact problem. While the gameplay is the same, Insomniac went for a deeper storyline that was more cinematic for lack of a better word. The original Ratchet & Clanks had a more satirical element to them that made fun of the capitalistic societal norms. Tools of Destruction moves all of that subtlety and tries to be like a Pixar movie. However, while they're trying to be really deep, they also maintained the tongue-in-cheek humor. However, since they removed the social commentary, it ends up sounding more juvenile, despite trying to be more character-driven compared to the originals. There's a lot of other problems holding it back, like the new characters don't feel as fleshed out and are mostly one-note, and the pirates are just kind of there as filler since they don't really contribute to Ratchet's past. Again, Tools of Destruction having a deep story isn't the problem. It's just that they didn't really go about it very well. And do you want to know how I know this is the case? A Crack in Time is looked at much more favorably. Even though it still followed Tools of Destruction's tone, they managed to create a storyline that felt satisfying, especially with the conclusion they delivered, which maybe got ruined by the presence of certain spin-offs. but my point still stands. So, what we can conclude from all this is that the reason these games aren't warmly received has nothing to do with how different they were. It was because the major changes they made from the source material either took something away or replaced it with poorly designed mechanics. These next examples may have done something similar, but their innovations don't hamper the enjoyment of the game and maybe go so far as to improve the experience from its predecessors. Take the LEGO games as an example. LEGO Batman 2 was the first entry to depart from telling stories with mimes and grunts to using fully voiced lines. Maybe there was a charm to how LEGO communicated their stories with so little words, but while the voice acting took away creativity, it replaced it with better characterization. The characters were more defined and developed with voice acting, which gives way to stronger original stories. LEGO Batman 2 didn't need to copy Tim Burton's 1989 movie because voice acting allowed for an original narrative. And finally, we return to Crash of the Titans. In one sense, the game took away, or at least put less emphasis, on the precision-based platforming of previous entries. You might cry out that this is the same fault of Jak 2, but the difference here is that Crash more or less needed a change. Whereas Jak 2 was a sudden switch from one game to the next, Crash had just been doing the same thing for years to the point it was stale. Titans may have reimagined a lot of characters and had a more beat-em-up style gameplay, but Radical Entertainment managed to make them work. The combat was serviceable at best, but the ability to mind-control mutants brings about some variety. The different takes on the characters were pretty funny, while also having some inspiration from the previous games. They took characters like Engine and Uka Uka and upped their personalities to 11, while they developed Nina's character into a more fully-fledged villain over the silent goth girl she was in Twinsanity. Radical Entertainment was spreading their wings out while still trying to be as true as they could to the source material. It's not perfect or anything, but the fact that it's different doesn't detract from the quality of the game, because the changes replaced what they took away with something that was just as good. And that's the crux of my argument. It's not the changes themselves that are bad. Rather, it's that they weren't implemented very well in the series. Jak 2 didn't have to have a darker atmosphere and story. The only reason they did that was to appeal to the broader gaming audience, and the result was a transformation that didn't seamlessly transition from the first game. Tools of Destruction didn't need to do away with the societal jokes jabbing at the negative consequences of the free market, but since they did, it sacrificed a lot of the charm of the original games and replaced it with filler and cringe comedy. Compare that with Crash of the Titans, and to a lesser extent LEGO Batman 2, in which they replaced what they took away with the new mechanics that worked, which in turn made for a fresh experience. For Titans, it was the fluid combat and solid characters, while for LEGO Batman 2, it was the voice acting that expanded upon the story. Yeah, it was different, but because they did a good job with designing these new features, it felt more like a welcome addition rather than a frustrating transformation. As Anton Ego from Ratatouille states in his review, the world is often unkind to new talent, new creations. The new needs friends. Ultimately, it's so easy to fall into the trap of judging a game based on how different it is from the source material, preventing them from evaluating it fairly. People may like consistency, but doing it too much is detrimental to a series, as seen with how the MCU keeps reusing old actors again. As soon as they begin doing this, they stop treating their respective art as a passion project and more as a means to please their niche. Consequently, what they end up missing out on is expanding their base beyond their normal audience, and that can only be done through innovation. So, hopefully this essay helped show the discrepancies with the argument, it's different and therefore ruined, but let me know in the comments why you might disagree with me. Until next time, I'm Dave Reviews, and I'll see you guys later.